In the name of God, I am here today with our online friend, Mr. Dale Husband, of great notoriety, and we're going to do this little podcast with each other. He's going to be asking me a couple of questions, and I guess I'll be doing most of the talking. How you doing today, Dale?
I'm fine, actually. Anyway, several months ago, I proposed that we do a podcast together in which I just ask you some basic questions about the Baha'i faith and your perceptions of it and everything. And I wrote out those questions, but then your wife suddenly died, and so those plans had to be put aside until you dealt with that matter.
Yeah.
And now it seems you've dealt with that pretty much, so we can go ahead and do this, and hopefully it'll work out for us. All right?
Let's see. Okay. Shoot.
All right. Okay, here is the first question. 1. Were you raised in the Baha'i faith, or were you a convert to it at some point?
Well, I was born into a Baha'i family, and I was pretty much raised as a Baha'i until my teens. One side of my family traces back their lineage to the family of Tahir Qurat al-Ain, the 17th letter of the living, Tahir. Another part of my family, from my father's side, they trace their lineage back to the Sheikhi school, and particularly the Kermani branch of the Sheikhi school. That was started up by Haj Muhammad Karim Khan Kermani, who was one of the enemies of the Bab, actually. So that's where my lineage goes to. But myself, I was born into a Baha'i family, and until my teens, I was pretty raised in a Baha'i family and raised in the milieu of Baha'ism. I always had questions, even as a child growing up. Just intuitively, I felt that there was something not right about all of this. And my father actually felt the same way, and we didn't actually realize this until many years later when, I formally left, and then he was kind of free to confide in me some of his own feelings about this thing. But, I'll tell this, I've said this story before in the past. I think where the real separation begins for me from Baha'ism begins in my early teens, after a dream I actually had. And this dream is actually quite a funny dream. I remember I was standing on a road somewhere, and along comes one of those very old orange school buses. Do you remember those, Dale? They used to have those in the United States.
Oh, yeah. Some parts still do.
Yeah, okay.
Although they tend to come in a variety of colors these days.
Yeah. Well, the dream was with one of those old orange school buses, and this orange school bus stops at this stop where I was at, and out of this school bus comes out Abbas Effendi Abdul Baha, and he was very angry, and he was barking at everybody around him. And in the dream, I walked up to him and I pulled down his pants.
Ooh.
And he turned around and gave me a really angry look, and then I woke up from the dream. This was probably when I was about 11 years old when I had this dream. And this dream, although it's kind of a comical dream, always was like, if this guy is such an important holy figure in the center of the covenant, why am I dreaming of pulling this guy's pants down? And why is this guy so angry in the dream? There's a lot of Jungian content, I guess, in this dream that can be unpacked. Any case,
Anyway.
by the time I got to the age of 15, I had a really good school teacher, and he gave me a copy of Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto. And, this little pamphlet, it is a pamphlet, it's not really a book, kind of began my intellectual and spiritual journey out of Baha'ism. And because, that book led to other things that I read. But all throughout my teens, I had observed, a disconnect and a lot of hypocrisy around me amongst the Baha'is, especially the middle-class Persian Baha'is. That was the subculture I came from. So by the time I left home for college in New Mexico, I was pretty much intellectually out of the Baha'i community already, out of the Baha'i faith. And then it took a couple of more years after that, where I had pretty much all but withdrawn. And then once the conflicts on the internet as a result of the talisman at in Indiana EDU list, I made the formal withdrawal back in October 1996.
Okay. My second question is, what was your favorite childhood memory about being a Baha'i? Something positive that you experienced when you were still a Baha'i.
Well, there was a lot of parties and a lot of get-togethers and a lot of good food. I will give them that. The potlucks and all of that, the incessant potlucking. So I guess the food, but this was the late 70s, and this was at a time where I think people, even beyond the Baha'i faith itself, had more of a sense of community than they do presently. You seldom see people getting together for community potlucks in any context or any community anymore. But in the 70s, in the late 70s, early 80s, this was happening a lot amongst the Baha'is in California and in Colorado, where I first grew up. That was going on quite a fair bit.
Well, when I was a Baha'i in North Texas, of course, there were still there was this guy named Fruzan of Zahi who lived in Bedford, Texas. Bedford's a suburb associated with Fort Worth. And he had these weekly firesides every Friday, which was practically an institution amongst the North Texas Baha'is. And he would do this every Friday, and they even came up with a title for the event called Fruzan Azahi's Fun-Filled Friday Firesides. And it was attending those firesides as a seeker that eventually led me to convert to the faith. So to some degree, at least when I was a Baha'i there, they were still doing these massive social events, so it didn't die out in the 1980s, I'm sure.
No, they were going full scale in the 1980s. I mean, everywhere you went, pretty much. But I think in the 90s, especially when I came back to the United States from Australia and started college, the disconnects and the ruptures and the fissures were just starting to occur. Once the internet came on, these things got gaping, Because at that point, you really felt, the authoritarian hand and the whole authoritarian vibe of this organization and what it's all about, with the internet itself.
Yeah. My third question was supposed to be, what was it about the Baha'i faith that eventually made you reject it? You've already touched upon some of those issues. Was there one thing in particular that made you think, no, this is not a good religion for me at all?
Well, it started with me, looking at, the lifestyles and the cognitive dissonance of these middle-class Iranian Baha'is in whether in Southern California, whether in Denver, whether in Australia. And at first I thought, well, maybe it's just, the subculture around me that's like this. And then, after I moved out of home and, began to explore, so this is everywhere, that there is a real problem here. There's a real disconnect. There's a real, words and deeds do not match. And because, my intellectual awakening had happened at the hands of Karl Marx and the Communist Manifesto, at the age of 15, 16, I was doing class, analysis, Marxian class analysis in a lot of these Baha'i functions. Everything that Marxian sociology speaks about the nature of the bourgeoisie, the middle class, was just in your face and in almost a exaggerated form with a lot of these, well-endowed, deep-pocketed Iranian Baha'is. Some of these people, the stories around some of these people, they had made fortunes in the property market during the time of the Shah, and then, put their money offshore and then came to the United States and were collecting food stamps and getting government assistance at the same time, lying to the governments at the time, and living in places like Beverly Hills, or, La Jolla, San Diego, and places like that. And this was the case everywhere. And this began, my perception that there's something wrong. And then once I looked even closely at the non-Persian Baha'i culture, and I found other problems, equally as bad and equally as insidious as the one that I'd seen growing up amongst the Persian middle class Baha'i culture.
For me, the biggest issue I had with the Baha'i faith toward the end of my time with it was the ministry of Shoghi Effendi. First of all, the fact that he literally threw out of the community virtually all of his relatives, his brothers, sisters, cousins, and aunts.
And
He
parents.
expelled all of them. I could understand maybe expelling a few dissenters, but every single one of them?
Yeah.
That didn't make sense to me at all. And then I found out, how he died so suddenly and under the most embarrassing circumstances possible.
Yeah.
And I thought, wait a minute, this does not compute. And that's what started me down the rabbit hole of questioning ultimately everything about the Baha'i faith.
Yeah.
So I resigned from the faith in January of 2005, and I never looked back.
Good for you. Yeah.
Okay, here's my fourth question. The Baha'i World Center is located in Israel, and how does that affect your view of the state of Israel?
Well, I have my, I come at the question of occupied Palestine. I don't refer to it as Israel, because I find this entire state and this whole project is to be an illegitimate colonial settler state. But how does that affect my perception? Well, on many different levels, because the Baha'i World Center has been a direct beneficiary of this colonial settler project. And this can be demonstrated in multiple ways. I mean, recently you've had Israeli scholars, who've come and put forth the evidence that, rather than them descending, the Zionist, European Zionists descending on the Holy Land, it was the Baha'is who actually were acting as go-betweens and property brokers and whatnot for these early arriving Zionists to Palestine. Then, after the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, you begin to see the kind of perquisites and advantages that the State of Israel gives to these people. And then until now, where the Baha'i World Center and its quote-unquote Baha'i Gardens have become a very important central feature of the Israeli tourism industry. And this settler colony is not only illegitimate, but it is, the perpetrator of genocide and ethnic cleansing against the indigenous people of that land. And for the Baha'is to be beneficiaries of all of this means that they are not only complacent, but they are part of that whole ethnic cleansing of Palestine, as Ilan Pop put it in his book.
I found it very puzzling that the Universal House of Justice would claim you're not supposed to be teaching the Baha'i faith openly in Israel. And also the Universal House of Justice has never made any statements with regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict in terms of trying to suggest solutions to the problem. It's like they don't even care.
They don't care because it is in their best interest. And in fact, there are statements from Ruhiya Maxwell that the destinies of the State of Israel and the Hyphen Baha'i organization are entwined. You can actually find some of these statements by her online. So they don't have any interest in addressing this issue. And in fact, if you look back into history, in modern history of the 20th century, the Baha'is have always flourished under authoritarian apartheid kind of regimes. They flourished in South Africa during the apartheid period. In fact, the Baha'i community of South Africa at the time was participant in the state apartheid of South Africa back then. They were very chummy with Idi Amin. In fact, hand of the cause Enoch Olinga lost his life as a result of the coup against Idi Amin. That's the reason why he died, because he was known to be a crony of Idi Amin. In Iran...
That's definitely something they do not publicize.
No, they don't publicize that. You had a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of Chile on the cabinet of Augusto Pinochet. You get your head around that one. Then in Iran, obviously we know they were very chummy with the Shah. In fact, they had become quite an elite in the royal court of the Shah. And you had the deputy director of Savak, the Shah's secret police, actually being a Baha'i. And these examples can be multiplied. They've done this everywhere, and they continue to do it even today.
Okay, here's my fifth question. What do you think of the Baha'i administrative order? Now, I'm not talking about, the Baha'i faith itself. I'm talking about the administrative order that's been set up as a sort of governing system. What do you think of that and how it operates?
I think it's a totalitarian system. It's a top-down management model. It both resembles the old models of the communist parties of the Eastern Bloc, as well as a modern corporation. It is hyper-authoritarian. Its decision makings are, structurally, I would say they are flawed because of that. And it is a very dangerous, in that sense, because the hyphen Baha'i organization in itself, since the death of its charismatic leaders, the last one being Shoghi Effendi, has basically transformed into operating within the context of an organization in the fold of the administrative order. So the Baha'i administrative order has become the raison d'etre. The very purpose animating Baha'ism is its administrative order today, and that is a very dangerous place to be as an ideology, I think.
Okay, here's my sixth question, because I see we've already... Okay, here it is. Okay, Baha'is claim that the United Nations was inspired by their religion. Do you think this is a valid claim?
No, I don't. I think it's like the Baha'i sightings that used to occur, where every celebrity under the sun was claimed as a Baha'i. The Baha'is have a tendency of claiming many things to be inspired and generated by them. There is no evidence of this. Because the United Nations is an internationalist body and subscribes to internationalism and globalism, does not mean that the Baha'is were responsible for inspiring its creation. These ideas were around even before the Baha'i faith. They've also claimed that the League of Nations was their idea. They've also claimed the daughter of Woodrow Wilson to have been a Baha'i, but there's scanty evidence to that effect, and so forth. So no, I don't believe that the United Nations was inspired by Baha'i ideas, not one bit.
Well, as for me, when I go directly to the writings of Baha'u'llah himself, I do not find a lot of the concepts that Abdu'l-Baha would later claim were a part of the Baha'i faith. Like, for example, Baha'u'llah obviously did not believe in the equality of men and women.
No, he didn't.
Abdu'l-Baha promoted that, supposedly, and yet at the same time, he and Shoghi Effendi and the Universal House of Justice itself would insist that no women would be a part of that body, which strikes me as hypocritical.
It's totally hypocritical. I would also submit that Abdu'l-Baha's subscription to the idea of gender equality was strategic, because before his trip to the West, there's a lot of evidence for that. And I believe even Ahmad Sohrab references this somewhere. I think it's in that bigger book, The Broken Silence, that there was a point wherein Abdu'l-Baha was seriously thinking of imposing a Baha'i version of the hijab on women, and that it was Ahmad Sohrab and one of the other Baha'is there who convinced him against it, because they told him that if he imposed a hijab on Baha'i women, that he would lose a Western audience. So he never went down that road. Now, if you notice, a lot of these Baha'i matriarchs, from the sister of Abbas Effendi to Ruhia Maxwell herself, were always seen in public wearing a sort of scarf around their head. In a sense, that was kind of a nod to this sort of female Baha'i version of the female hijab. So the Baha'is claiming equality and the emancipation of women, these are talking points that have no reality. And the fact that women can't serve on the Universal House of Justice, and there's absolutely no explanation for it, and this was also Baha'u'llah's own conception, and is solid proof that this whole idea of gender equality in Baha'ism is a farce. It's just a gimmick, to draw people in and nothing else.
Okay, here's the next question. The Baha'i faith originated in Iran and Iraq. How does that affect your view of those two countries?
Well, I would argue that the Baha'ism actually doesn't originate in either Iran or Iraq. Baha'ism technically originates on the Black Sea coast of Turkey in Aderna or Adrianople in the 1867-68 period. The Baha'is have retroactively falsified history, claiming that Baha'u'llah made a declaration in this garden of Najib Pasha in Baghdad on the eve before they were expelled out of Iraq to Turkey. And then they tried to claim Babism as kind of the movement that originated then, when the fact of the matter is that Baha'ism is actually a schism of Bahaism, and from the perspective of the religion of the Bayan, has no legitimacy whatsoever at all. So it is a schism.
Okay. So what is your concerns regarding Iran these days?
My concern about Iran are multiple. I mean, that's a 1 hour podcast unto itself. My concern is I don't wish a war to unfold on Iran. I don't want to see my motherland be subjected to the same kind of thing that Syria or Libya were subjected to. These violent regime change kind of operations that end up breaking a society. I'm not particularly well disposed towards, at least in theory, to the Islamic Republic of Iran, because it is, in theory, a hyper-authoritarian state, and also they haven't fulfilled on a single promise that they made at the very beginning of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. They've kind of veered into a different direction. Their domestic policy sucks, but their foreign policy has been excellent. I mean, I have to give them kudos for that. They have had one of the best foreign policies of any Iranian system ever. And I just hope that none of this leads to any kind of war in the region of war in Iran, because if that happens, you're going to see the destruction of about almost 5,000 years of culture. And, this is a world heritage. It's not just a heritage of the Iranian people.
Well, I have no doubt if the United States, under Donald Trump, is actually stupid enough to go to war with Iran, it will destroy forever the credibility of the United States as a global power, and the whole world will reject it. So I really hope that doesn't happen, Well,
I mean, to some degree, the presidency of Donald Trump has already done that. But yeah, you're right. If they actually, take that step, and do it, then the credibility. The international order as America conceives it will be permanently ripped up, and that will be the end of that. And that's actually a very dangerous situation to be, because then it encourages lawlessness. It encourages nuclear proliferation. It encourages the kind of world that we don't want. The rule of law is a good thing. A world based on the rule of law, an international order based on the rule of law, even if there are individual nation states, is a very good thing. It is a good thing to have. Now, the Baha'is also like to claim credit for conceiving of this idea, but history demonstrates otherwise. Yeah.
Oh. Okay, you've talked about the United States a little bit. So the next question naturally is, the Baha'i writings seem to focus a lot on the United States, and why do you think that was so?
Well, the Baha'i writings that have been translated into English have this Amerocentrism. But, the bulk of the Baha'i writings are in Persian and Arabic, and they don't reference America all that much. The reason I would say that these particular writings of Abbas Effendi specifically have been translated is because they were trying to recruit people and appealing to American nationalism, patriotism, whatever you want to call it. And so that is why that was a target audience. So they're basically translating these writings and pulling people in that way.
Okay, so basically it was just a gimmick.
Yeah,
right.
Of course, yeah.
All right then. Next question, number 9. Let's see. What are your views of Islam and its relationship with the Baha'i faith?
Well, my views on Islam, first of all, which Islam are we talking about? Because there's a misconception in the West currently that Islam is a monolithic entity. It is not. Never has been. It probably wasn't from the very moment that the Prophet Muhammad passed away. And,
I know about the Sunni Shia split, and that Baha'is arose from 12er Shia version of Islam.
Or at least Babism did. The Baha'is came out of Babism. My views are positive about Islam, and as the views of most Iranians, we may not agree with the fundamentalists and the Islamists, but our views from a cultural point of view is very positive, because Islamicate. This is a term that a University of Chicago professor of history, Marshall Hodgson, coined in his magnum opus, 3 volumes, The Adventure of Islam. Islamicated does not necessarily mean that people need to be even believers in a creed or an ideology or religion, but they belong to a culture that is Islamic or Islamaic or Islamicate. And Islamicate culture for the 1400 years of its existence has produced an immense amount of culture, immense amount of philosophy, very interesting stuff, and it is part of the greater Abrahamic tradition and has to be accepted as such, whatever certain people believe about the so-called clash of civilizations. And I've mentioned this in one of the interviews I did about a year ago, that, contrary to certain opinions, Islam is not an Eastern religion. It is actually a Western religion, and because it is part of the Abrahamic creed. Eastern religions are Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and what have you, but Islam is part of the Abrahamic family, and so culturally it is Western in that sense.
Yeah. I was raised a Christian, specifically from the Southern Baptist version of Christianity. And I can tell you, the Southern Baptist Convention began as a revolt against these enlightened Northern Baptists who wanted to take a strong stand against slavery. And so the Southern Baptists said, no, you can't do that because the Bible endorses slavery. This was before the Civil War when slavery was abolished. Yep. So they split. And ever since then, the Southern Baptists have lagged behind most other Christians in America in terms of views of race, civil rights, women's rights, and everything else. But I was raised in that kind of environment, that kind of hardcore fundamentalist Baptist view. And it wasn't until I was attending college around the age of 20 that I was exposed to anything else.
I see.
Still, though, the fact that I was raised a Christian, I know the Christian religion better than, almost any other religion, actually puts me in a position to criticize it more than any other religion, other than the Baha'i faith, of course.
Of course.
Anyway, let's move on to the last question, which is, can you describe your current religious views?
Yeah, sure. I am a Bayani. I am a adherent of the religion of the Bab and his successor Sultan Azal. That's pretty clear.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain what a Bayani is? Is that the same as a Babi?
Yeah, it's the same thing. The Bayan is the name of the scripture of the religion of the Bab. The Babism is just a moniker. The self-referential term is Bayani or the Bayan, the religion of the Bayan. And the Bayan is, as I've kind of explained it in the past in a couple of different papers, is what one would classify as being a post-Islamic form of Twelver Shiite esotericism and gnosis. So it's a deeply mystical religion. It kind of inhabits both the space of Islam and post-Islam simultaneously.
Well, you certainly lack the paranoia toward Islam that many Baha'is seem to have towards it. I've noticed this about them. They even came up a few months ago with this ridiculous assertion that most of the ex-Baha'is in Reddit were actually people who were Muslim, which is certainly not true of me, of course. But this guy came in and he was asserting this repeatedly, and I'm like, are you for real? This seems so ridiculous. But he was trying to stigmatize us with this association with Muslims and with the Islamic State of Iran, which I've never had any connection with Iran, so it was just slander, Yeah,
it was slander, but these people make themselves ridiculous making these sorts of slurs. Look, like I said, I have family on both sides who trace their lineage to some very important people, at least of the last 200 years of Iranian history, and these people were Shiite Muslims. And the culture of Shiism is not reducible to either the Ayatollah Khomeini, although my views on the Ayatollah Khomeini are very different from a lot of people. I think that the man had both a dark side and a light side, and his light side is just as interesting as his dark side. He was kind of like a Sith Jedi in some way. And same with the regime in Iran. Nevertheless, the fact is that Baha'is from a very young age, Persian Baha'is and non-Persian Baha'is, are bombarded and ideologically pushed towards Islamophobia. So long before Islamophobia was hip in the West itself, the Baha'is were already in on this game. I heard amazing things, from the mouths of extended family members growing up, and I basically did, went through a process, a psychological process myself, to basically unpack all of this stuff, and that sparked my interest in Islamic history and Islamic mysticism especially. And through the works of a great French Iranologist and Islamologist by the name of Henry Corbin, I began to look at Islam from a completely different perspective than most Baha'is or even a lot of people in the West have looked at Islam. And it's a very deeply rich and deeply spiritual culture that has still a lot of things to say to the world if we look beyond the crazies. And the crazies are everywhere. The crazies exist in the West. As you say, you come from a Southern Baptist background. There's quite a lot of crazies amongst Southern Baptists.
Yeah.
Also amongst Jews. Also amongst and obviously amongst Muslims. And I look at this as a function of modernism and capitalism that seems to produce these very narrow-minded, straight-jacketed ideologies in this form.
Like I said, I come from a Christian background, so I'm painfully aware that throughout the history of Christianity, anti-Semitism has been a basic
yes, it has.
flavor of it.
Yeah.
It's only recently, that most Christians have tried to pull away from that nonsense.
Well,
so
I mean,
we're trying to evolve away from that, but it's not Christianity itself that's doing that. It's the modern influences from outside the religion that's making us pull away from that kind of extremism.
Well, hopefully they will. Hopefully they will. And I think the way that Christians can probably do that is to embrace the esoteric and mystical traditions of their own faith. Look at figures like, for example, Jacob Bohm, or Jakob Bohm, as they call him here in Germany, or Meister Eckhart, or Emanuel Swedenborg. Those are the traditions and the kind of figures that I believe could save Christianity from this very narrow-minded approach. And the same goes for the Islamic world. If people embrace the esoteric and mystical and Gnostic milieu of that religion, then it will save it from these fundamentalist crazies ultimately.
Yeah. Well, that's all my questions now. Did you have any questions you wanted to ask me in return?
Well, I mean, the question I would have for you is, okay, you left in 2005. How has your life changed? What have you learned since 2005, since you left the Baha'i faith?
Well, after I left the Baha'i community, I cut myself off completely from the Fort Worth Baha'is. I didn't want to associate with them because I knew I didn't belong with them anymore. And instead, in order to avoid being tempted to ever return to them, I went and joined up with the Unitarian Universalist Church. Mm-hmm. Now, many people mistakenly think that UU churches and Baha'is are very similar. But having been in the Baha'i faith, I know that's not true because the Baha'i faith is this very authoritarian style cult. Yep. And the UUs are like the polar opposite of that, encouraging free thinking and not being authoritarianism at all. So I joined up with the UUs, and in that free thinking environment that I was ultimately able to get the courage within myself to start blogging against the Baha'i faith. And the UUs have really supported me in that. They've encouraged me to teach about the Baha'i faith, my knowledge about it, my criticisms of it, and everything.
That's awesome.
So,
I mean, I knew a lot of ex-Baha'is that kind of found their way. I mean, the UU is very specific to the United States. It's not outside of the United States. You won't find, at least as far as I know, you won't find any UU chapters. But
for the most part, that's true. But there are some, including myself, who do want it to become an international existence. And there are Unitarians outside the United States, of course, in England and in parts of Africa, in India and such. So the Unitarians, they're Christians who reject the Trinity, which they see as a pagan influence.
It is. It is a pagan influence. Very much so. So let me ask you this. So what is the theology of Unitarians? I mean, it sounds like one of the early, at least what the church calls a heresy, but it sounds like Arianism, the doctrine of Arian, who believed the Trinity and looked at Jesus more as a sort of an inspired prophet figure. Is that a similar theology as the UU?
Well, basically, Unitarians and the Universalists were both descended from the far liberal wing of Protestantism, which of course began in Europe.
I guess. Yeah.
And over time, both of those bodies, the Unitarians and Universalists in the United States, came closer to each other and away from mainstream Christianity to the point that by the time they merged to form the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1961, most Christians did not consider them to be Christian anymore because their religion was no longer Bible-based.
Uh-huh.
All right? So they do include Christians amongst them, as well as Jews, pagans, and atheists.
I see.
But their basic attitude is expressed in what's called 7 principles, which you can look up online anytime.
Sure.
But anyway, those 7 principles are the core of Unitarian Universalist teachings, and all the other things, the theological aspects or whatever, are things that you can bring into the religion as an expression of your personal beliefs. It's not necessarily the beliefs of Unitarian Universalists. We focus on the 7 principles. We don't focus on religious dogmas so much.
I see. Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, there was a friend, a very wizened gentleman who lived in California, Cal Rollins of blessed memory. He passed away a few years ago. He was very active online until his passing, and he recommended the UU to a lot of people who were being turned away or being turned off by Baha'ism. And he had been active in both, I understand, the Baha'i community and the UU for quite a number of years. And he had been in the civil rights movement and whatnot in the 1950s. So he was quite a veteran, that guy. May he rest in peace. He was a great guy. Good friend, too.
Yeah, I'll tell you something interesting that happened recently. I was contacted via Facebook by a Baha'i that I actually knew when I was in the faith. He was only a child when I knew him, okay? But he contacted me, and he was asking me about what I'd been doing. He knew I'd left the faith, okay? So he was asking me about myself. And I was cautious, okay? Because I felt like I was being maybe spied upon or something.
Yeah, which they do.
We got to talking, and I later documented my discussion on a blog entry I published. But it turns out, apparently, even though his parents are still Baha'is and everything, he no longer is as much into the faith as he used to be, partly because of my influence. He's read my blog entries about the Baha'i faith, and he didn't dispute anything I wrote in them. And he asked me specifically about Unitarian Universalist and what they believe and what sort of church I go to. So to me, that's a positive sign.
Well, from everything that I'm hearing, there is great disenchantment within the Baha'i community, especially with the people who are not connected to the administration or have in some way been disempowered by it. So if we're talking about Baha'is, we have to distinguish between the adminolators, those who worship the administration, and those who have been either turned away or disenchanted by it. And, there are lots and lots of disenchanted Baha'is out there. Lots and lots of people. A lot of these people are afraid to take the next step and actually leave it. We would encourage these people to take that step and to leave this cult for their own sakes and for their own sanity and for their own future and that of their children, if they have any. Because there is a better world beyond Baha'ism.
I think the basic problem is that, like this guy, his parents are still Baha'is, and naturally he loves his parents. He doesn't want to alienate them.
Yeah, it's always the same story. Same story.
I didn't have Baha'i relatives myself, so that wasn't an issue. When I left, I could just leave, Well,
I had an extended family, and some of these people turned against me. Luckily, I managed to pull both my parents out of this cult. My father, he couldn't wait to get out, but he, in respect to his own parents, he left it until he passed away and just left the matter in his will and testament that he didn't want to belong to this cult, didn't want to be buried according to their laws because he didn't consider himself to be a Baha'i. This is the thing that, and I've discussed this with Kayvon Yahya and other people in other podcasts, is that, these family networks are kind of the mechanism by which they keep people in. And this is very typical kind of modus operandi of a cult. And this is where you know that you're dealing with a cult, is where they prevent people from leaving by manipulating them through their family networks. People need to find their courage and walk out. Basically find their own life. The unexamined life, as Plato said, is not worth living. And if you have examined the Baha'i faith and found it wanting, then you must take the next step. If you're any kind of person of conscience, and desert this thing and take other people out with you. So let's turn that Baha'i principle on its head and tell these people, disenchanted people, each one teach one. Those of you who are disenchanted, encourage others who are disenchanted to get out.
Yeah, I just find it amazing that I started writing about the Baha'i faith about 11 years ago. And since then, so many other critics of the faith have taken my blog entries and spread them around, making me a de facto celebrity, much to my surprise.
And this is what happens every time when you have a Baha'i, like yourself, many others. When we become public over these issues, as much as these Baha'is, claim that we're non-persons and we're demons and this, that, and the other thing, they always end up making celebrities out of us. They create the notoriety for us. We're not creating the notoriety. They are.
Yeah. All I'm doing is writing about what I know.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's pretty much it for us. So I thank you so much for consenting to this interview with me.
Not a
Wahid Azal.
problem.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Have a good day.
You too.